Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Latin America Review. And today we're going to be talking about Guatemala. And we're here with our very good friend Cindy Forster, who is also a contributor on many occasions to Causation News. And she has had the privilege of just interviewing Thelma Cabrera, a leader, indigenous leader there in Nicaragua, leader of the political party of the MLP, the Movement for the Liberation of the Peoples. And we're going to talk a bit about Cindy's experiences in Nicaragua and speaking to her, and as well as a kind of introduction to the interview that we'll be publishing with Thelma Cabrera. Cindy, so good to have you on here. And listen, I wanted to, for people who perhaps don't know very much about Guatemala, who don't know many of the political actors, you spoke to Thelma Cabrera these past few days. Could you explain in layman's terms who Thelma Cabrera is, what the MLP is as a political organization, for those who perhaps don't know too much about Guatemala? An introduction.
Absolutely. It's such an honor to be asked to talk about, first of all, to be asked to talk on Causa Chuncoca, but also to be able to interview Delma Cabrera Perez. She is a Maya mom organizer of many decades, um, working with a group that formed in 1992 named CODECA, which stands for a committee that serves the development needs of campesinos. 90% of the people in CODECA are uh, not only campesinos, but are landless. So they're forced to work in just horrific conditions on the plantations of agro-industry. Now it's an organization that's national. Maybe talk a little bit about that later. But she herself was born into this country where the Maya, the indigenous, are the majority, and Mayan campesinos are impoverished, in the words Codeca uses, or forced into just extreme poverty. When she grew up, like many families in among the majorities on the South Coast that uh, rises up to the volcanoes from the Pacific, in the cane fields, the coffee groves, the banana groves, and so forth. It's one of the richest areas of probably Latin American agro industry, and its people are among the poorest. So she was forced, as with her family, to scrounge for food in local dumps. Um, when she was raised, they still had a little bit of land on which they could grow corn and other things they wished to, but agro industry has been so um, savage, so rapacious, that there's really no longer any land for their labor force to work on, and their labor force is largely impermanent. Um, so she, as a mother of 4 children, followed her husband into organizing with Codeca after it formed in 1992. There's longer histories that we should probably talk about, of how campesinos in that exact area across, decades prior had won many of the things, such as agrarian reform, that Codeca is now fighting for. But in any case, she and her husband responded to this call for land to the tiller, for land ownership, for redistribution, that then became a much broader call for women's rights, for indigenous rights, the rights of youth. Um, and in recent decades, like just really taking on structural injustice through challenging transnationals. She's a powerful presence, tremendously charismatic, which really doesn't distinguish her from most of the people in Codeca, who are just extraordinary individuals. Um, and inherit 5,000 years of Mayan existence on lands that they know are theirs. So maybe I'll stop there and see
Yeah,
where you
absolutely.
think we
And
should
one
go.
thing I find very interesting about the movement, indigenous movement there in Guatemala, is that they raise the demand of the plurinational state, going beyond the sort of post-colonial republic. And of course, Cindy, you know, we know each other from your work in Bolivia, and Bolivia is a plurinational state. And it is the Bolivian experience something that you think Guatemala can take on, and is many of the demands of the indigenous movement now similar to what Bolivia has implemented with the creation of the plurinational state?
Absolutely, yes. As a person who just deeply admires Bolivia, the reason I went there, actually with friends who are campesinos in Guatemala, was to um, admire up close hand, what the plurinational state has been doing. I think, as you mentioned, the plurinational state is the central demand of the movement for the liberation of the peoples, the MLP, that Delba Cabrera is their presidential candidate. And then there's a sort of famous lawyer, human rights person who's the vice presidential candidate. But she has visited Bolivia. She's a fast friend of those in MAS. And in fact, the struggles of the South Coast, where she in particular was born and raised, and continues to live, are, to my mind, very similar to the struggles of the cocaleras and the cocaleros. So, in terms of going up against imperialist power in the agro industry. An agro-industry collective, maybe that's too kind a word, that runs the state. So there's tremendous understanding of the cocaleros' struggle against the Drug Enforcement Agency, against a narco state. In many ways, Guatemala today, its oligarchy has always been very powerful, but today it's in many ways a narco state. And the strength, it's really, the willingness of the oligarchy to murder people who resist it. In Guatemala, Mayan campesinos, in Bolivia, the indigenous, the 36 nations who were challenging structural injustice is, very close kinship. The people in Codeca, like the Cocaleros, also like the Aymara, the Quechua, have suffered disproportionate assassinations. Guatemala is probably, or is, one of the places on earth where campesino organizers are killed in the greatest numbers proportionately to their population. And of the 26 leaders of Codeca, for instance, who've been killed in the last 4 years, not one of them has been investigated, much less jailed. The platform of Codeca, which many in Codeca believe they came very close to winning, or they did win in the last elections. They lost by only a few points to the current president under Telma Cabrera's candidacy. It has 19 proposals. Each of those was discussed, created, then voted on from the community up through the national level. So its organizing is similar to the Bolivian indigenous organizing in terms of its dramatically horizontal collective approach. It's resisted just these, this stream of murders. I'll stop there so I don't. You need to stop me because I just won't stop if you don't.
No, no. I mean, this is a space for extended thoughts and reflection, so there's no stopping here. But I briefly, I wanted to touch. You mentioned the last elections. The current president of Guatemala, for people who don't know, is Alejandro Giammattei. Now, I first heard of him when he was president elect of Guatemala, and he attempted to go to Venezuela during the attempted coup in 2019 by Juan Guaido to some sort of meeting or conference that he had organized. And he tried to enter Venezuela on his Italian passport. He is a citizen of Italy, and he attempted to get into Venezuela on his Italian passport without mentioning the fact that he was the president elect of Guatemala. But the Venezuelan authorities did realize and sent him back to Guatemala. But yeah, just very briefly, what could you tell us about the current president of Guatemala and the current government? They're at the moment the party in power and their approach to the country.
I would say that. Am I still on the air?
Yes, yes.
Great. They're not that distinct from most of the people who've held presidential power since the CIA coup of 1954, with very rare exceptions. They represent, they're extremely committed to the agro industry, agro export, oligarchy, and mining. Most people are probably aware that Guatemala is one of the most corrupt nations in the hemisphere. And the current president is no exception. I'd say that it's critical to understand that violence is their favorite tool against the majorities of Guatemalan who are campesino and working class. So it's a style of governance that those in opposition to it call the Pact of the Corrupt, or the Alliance of the Corrupt. They rob state coffers to the greatest degree they can. After they leave office, some have gone to prison, serving prison sentences for that corruption. In the opinion of the poor, they should be serving prison sentences for genocide. Guatemala has one of the highest proportionate figures of violence during their recent era of revolutionary war, at least maybe not recent for people thinking in terms of the 20th century, but that war ended in 1996 and it lasted from 1961. So when the military dictatorships weren't in power, their allies were. They often took off their uniforms and entered government whenever they could. And that alliance, I think, is more important than the particulars of the kinds of corruption and violence. Perhaps just to note that the entire judicial system, even the human rights system, the state is just profoundly corrupt, and people within Codeca as well as outside of it are expressing the fear that if this fraud is allowed to continue, that Guatemala will be facing another period of armed violence, because it's virtually impossible to stay alive. Immigrants are they're responsible for about 20% of the gross national product, and many people who don't want to leave are driven out by this pact of the corrupt and by just this tremendous violence just among Codeca, like people being beheaded, people being Telma Cabrera, in her recent interview, mentioned just two of them. Dominga Ramos, who was killed about 3 years ago in her own home to sow terror, or there's a leader who's not Maya but Xinca, Luis Marroquin, who is the regional coordinator of the Department of Jalapa, killed in recent years. And it's the brutality with which people are killed is part of the president's ruling style. It's never worked, of course, but it has driven large numbers of people in the middle class who are working against the pact of the corrupt out of the country, whereas people such as Telma Cabrera, multiplying that by millions, are still in the country. And I dare say she would win if she were allowed to run. So many people who are not elites just love her.
Yeah, absolutely. And mentioning the fact that the current president, Alejandro Giammattei, is a citizen of Italy, reminds me in some ways of in Bolivia when the former president in the early 2000s, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, used to speak Spanish with an American accent, and for that reason he's called I think a lot of people don't realize how Guatemala is a really indigenous country in a lot of the ways that Bolivia is as well. Could you just give a brief outline of the makeup of Guatemala and the indigenous nations that exist, and how representative people like Alejandro Giammattei, a citizen of Italy, perhaps is of the country that he rules over?
No, absolutely, you stated it yourself. It's as in Bolivia, it's often contested by the elite, the degree to which the country is majority indigenous. Most in Guatemala, among those dozens of nations, are Mayan nations. Telma Cabrera is Maya Mam. The speakers, she speaks a language that was spoken by people who ruled commercial city-state in the place where she lives, which is called El Asintal, for 2,000 years. Like that city-state flourished. It had relations with central Mexico, with the entire sort of regions in that vast Mesoamerican region where people were trading with each other. They were creating societies and communities. I think that city-state ruled from like 1,000 years before the Common Era to 1,000 years after, and people are deeply, profoundly aware of those ancient realities. It's part of people's values. There are also Garifuna or Garinagu Afro-Indigenous peoples along the Central American coast. Likewise, in Guatemala, the vice presidential candidate of the left, one of the left parties in the last presidential race, was Garifuna. And then there are the Xinca, who I mentioned, who are not Maya as well. And the way that people worship, the way that people care for the land, the way they raise their children is just so profound. As in Bolivia, right, the distinctions from European, Eurocentric, white, capitalist understandings of living on the earth. So the demands such as rights to the planet, rights to understanding water, rights to sort of challenging human-centric understandings of the planet are coming from the same trunk or the same root as in Bolivia. Delma Cabrera talks about her mother as her main source of inspiration. Her mother had no formal education, which is a way of saying that her education and her values were profoundly about those many tens of thousands of years living on those lands, caring for those lands. Now the agro-industry belt to the south coast and also toward the other on the side of the Caribbean and into the rainforests of the north are poisoned, like totally poisoned. Telma Cabrera says not even the fruit trees bear any fruit. All the people living there, especially children, the elderly, pregnant women, are suffering the serious diseases of a capitalist approach and understanding of exploiting the land, really raping the land, and the people who are doing that are precisely the same people who rule the country. Mining in recent decades has become as sort of vile and dangerous and vast a reality as agro-industry. So that's gold, it's silver, it's blasting off mountains, it's destroying people's homes and lands, their ability to even produce. But in Guatemala, indigenous organizers realized that early enough that in a number of areas under the Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, they started voting massively to refuse the right to foreign transnationals to mine their lands. So like over a million indigenous in a country that's small were able to have been able to refuse the right to mining companies to come into their indigenous communities. Many people are still monolingual speakers, especially women in the countryside. And among youth who were not monolingual speakers, there's a huge and flourishing sector that's celebrating its cultural is kind of too thin a word or too weak a word to describe like just how profound the understandings of what it means to preserve or even not preserve, but just build and continue the realities of Guatemala as a indigenous plurinational place. And I think because of the degree of the genocide, like there are few indigenous families who haven't been touched by it. Geographically, there are areas that are more mestizo over toward the Caribbean and moving toward Honduras. But even in those areas, people are sort of reclaiming the indigenous identities of their grandparents, not like the Lenca had reclaimed, whose martyr Berta Cáceres was part of that process. So the race wars are obviously 500 years old. They're all about class. And because they've always been so harsh, for most of the 20th century, there have been really interesting histories of the left, often taking a socialist frame rather than more, what some people might call, it's a European term, but what some people might call an anarchist frame. And I think that's necessarily so because people know the state is like what's committing genocide against them. So the sort of need to challenge the state through a vast political movement um, I'm not sure if I think most people probably know that there were 10 years of democracy in the 20th century from 1944 to 1954. Um, Probably outside Guatemala, most people know about the its overthrow by the CIA and the United States that, in fact, was trying to overthrow it from the time it came to power. Actually, before it came to power, across those 10 years, took them a long time to build a proxy army from Honduras. Um, but in that revolution, I think what a lot of folks don't know is that its fiercest defenders were campesinos. Many, if not most of them, indigenous, outside the agro industry belt, but also in the agro industry plantation zones and precisely where Codeca first arose. So there, many decades of actually vast organizing among campesinos and a recognition of who in the state has stood for their rights. So in those 10 years of spring, they're called, from 1944 to 1954, the campesinos massively voted for the most radical sectors who, and then pushed them to agrarian reform in 1952. In 1953, which was a central reason why the United Fruit Company made sure that stopped with the coup. And there were about 1,000 people killed at that point. Uh, Many of them, if not most of them, on a United Fruit Company plantation called Hocotan, um, in their major banana growing zone near where Telma Cabrera lives. They were rounded up from up and down that coast, south coast, from the lists of campesinos who had received land or who were part of organizing committees. They're all called communists, and they were shot into large open trenches that had been dug out by tractors. And people remember that. It became very dangerous to state it across the ensuing dictatorships. But among those who stated it were actually guerrilla armies. Um, and some of the people who perpetrated that in after the coup of 1954 were, I guess you'd call it popular justice, were brought to justice by children of those who had been massacred. So the memory of the campesinos is exceedingly deep and often bears, until recently, pretty little relationship to what's written. But it's just a tremendously conscious population that many, extraordinary organizers have been driven out of the country just to stay alive. Often because they're threatened, by the gangs that are in the pay of the larger narco trafficking networks. And I mentioned that Guatemala is a narco trafficking state in many ways, and you can't even have a little tortilla making stand in the poorest of the neighborhoods in Guatemala City without paying off the people who are called gangs, but they're actually direct employees of the narco trafficking elites, including, of course, many of the politicians who use those networks to stay in power.
Yeah, no, thank you, Cindy. And just to finish off, at the moment, in February, at the end of February, Thelma Cabrera's political party, well, she was essentially banned from standing in upcoming elections by the current authorities in Guatemala. Can you just explain what's happening there, why that's happening, what's the reasoning given by the state, and has there been a response as well from people in Nicaragua? in Guatemala, sorry.
Guatemala, right? No worries. Absolutely, there's been a response. The reason is clearly that Codeca is, in a profound way, most thoroughly challenging structural injustice. So they, some of the things she says, we cannot beg favors from the bosses. They're for many years they've been organizing people against privatization, in particular electricity, which is actually there's Energuate, the corporation that runs that is transnational. It's British. But people have stopped paying a portion of their electricity bills and have been met with terror for doing that in a collective, vast sense. So their claims, in answer to your question of why her ticket is being excluded, it's the most thoroughgoing ticket against capitalism and imperialism. And there's not really a challenge to the degree to which they plan to create a new reality, just as in Bolivia, like the Pachacuti or the plurinational state is not at all shy or silent about stating its challenge to oligarchies that have been in power for 500 years, but probably more importantly to the United States empire and all its underlings. So they're going up against savage capitalism, which is, quite literally killing people on the plantations. So I think there have been particular dates, February 23rd, March 25th, at which the ticket of Condeca has challenged its exclusion on the grounds that the vice president, Jordan Rodas, who was a human rights ombudsperson or procurador, that's attorney general, I guess, who was very effective in actually challenging corruption, and the highest levels of the state went after him at that time. He's quite a person, quite a strength, driven out of the country into exile. But they kept him from running on sort of ridiculous grounds. It was something that he had met part of the requirements for forming part of the presidential and vice presidential slate. And then something was invented days after he'd met that requirement. He couldn't even find out what the charges were for a while. And then at every turn, like at every one of these deadlines, he's been blocked at the same time that people with much graver impediments to being president are in the running, such as an individual named Sandra Torres, who was jailed for a while, then absolved of ties with narco trafficking to fund her earlier presidential bids. She came in second in the last two races, if memory serves. And she's in the running, even though, like, the precise reason she shouldn't be is after having been Catholic, she ended up divorcing her husband, who was president, in order to run herself, and that upset the Catholics. But she became an evangelical minister, and anybody who's a minister or part of any kind of cult or religious faith is not allowed to run as president. A third woman is probably the most notorious that I hope people have heard about. She's the daughter of the dictator Efraín de Rios Montt, who only ruled for a year and a half in the early 80s and managed to kill more people more quickly than anybody in the same amount of time. So just a very vicious, among many vicious dictators, possibly the most vicious. He had a long-running trial and then died. But from the time she was, I think she's now in her mid to late 50s, and his daughter, whose name is Zuri Rios de Sousa, from the time Zuri was 22 years old, she was defending her father. She's been a long-standing congressperson, together with her father in Congress. And the genocide they committed was extraordinary. Both she and her father are very close to the right wing in the United States. So her father, during the Reagan years, was viewed with tremendous favor by evangelicals in the United States. It's an international alliance, right? And Zuri has had among her husbands people from the United States. And she, for as long as I've been watching her, since the 90s, has been declaring that there was no genocide. So absolutely opposed to the very idea of a genocide, which sort of places her in the category of somebody like Janina Áñez, the coup president in Bolivia, with the difference that Janina Áñez had basically 12 months to express those ideas, whereas the oligarchy in Guatemala has been killing people in enormous massacres, as well as one by one, with as much torture as they can achieve to try and terrorize people into not doing what they have never stopped doing, which is demanding equality, dignity for all, and actually an end to capitalism and imperialism.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I think it's such a comprehensive explanation that is really going to help our listeners. So thank you so much for that. This is Cindy Forster, professor at Scripps College in the United States, and also a sometimes contributor to Kazachi News, of course. And we're so grateful to have you on today, and for all that you've done for Kazachi News, including the interview with Thelma Carrera that we'll be releasing over the next few days. And we're really excited for that, and we hope this can be a springboard for that as well. So thank you so much, Cindy.
Such an honor. Just a huge honor. Thank you.